Hi, Aunt Em here from Aunt Em's Quilts and Em's Scrap Bag, and today I'm going to teach you how to do a piece of cake X and plus block. The quilt behind me is my 3 Red Hot Kisses. You can do this quilt with 2 layer cakes, or you can just supplement and use leftover charm squares, layer cakes, and jelly rolls. Let me show you how. But before we get started, remember, if you like my videos, to like and subscribe so that you don't miss any of them. Thanks. Okay, from your layer cake square, well, most of them you're going to want to cut a 4.5 inch strip, and then 2 2.5 inch strips. From your 4.5 inch strip, you're going to cut that into 2 4.5 inch squares. From one of your 2.5 inch strips, you're going to want to cut one 6.5 inch by 2.5 inch rectangle and one 2.5 inch square. From your remaining 2.5 inch strip, you're going to cut one 2.5 inch square. From the others of your layer cakes, you're going to just cut 4 4.5 inch squares. What I did with the leftover of this strip from my layer cake is I cut it into 2.5 inch squares, and then I used it in the border. From your lighter layer cake squares, you're going to cut just 2.5 inch strips, and then you're just going to subcut those. You'll go all the way across 2.5 inch, you'll get 4 of them, and then you're just going to subcut those into 2.5 inch squares, and you'll just cut those out of a bunch of your layer cake squares, or if you're supplementing, you can use jelly roll strips and charm squares to fill in. I don't know if you're like me, but sometimes I end up with just leftover when I'm using pre-cut layer cakes, charm squares. They just end up in my stash. For each of the blocks, you're going to need 4 4.5 inch squares. You're going to need 12 of the 2.5 inch squares of your background, the lighter. And then you're going to need the 2 2.5 inch squares from the layer cake, plus 2.5 by 6.5 for each of your squares. On the back of your 2.5 background squares, on 8 of those, you're going to draw from corner to corner across diagonal. All right? We're going to take one of our background squares, place it on one of the 4.5 inch squares so our diagonal line runs along here, and we're going to stitch across this line. Then you're going to take it to the ironing board, set the seam, and press it open. Or press it back. And then we're just going to trim our seam allowance along here. We'll just trim our seam allowance. Here's our seam, so 1/4 inch from there. Just going to trim it. Then we're going to take another of our 2.5 inch background squares, place it on the opposite corner, and we're going to stitch along our drawn line. Then we'll press and trim as before. And we'll do that with our remaining 4.5 inch squares. 4.5 inch squares. Next, we're going to take our 2.5 inch for the pluses and put them with 2.5 inch squares of the background. And we're just going to sew those together along the edge here. So we're going to lay out our block. Here are our 4.5 inch square units. So we lay out our block. This is our 6.5 inch. We have a 2.5 inch and a 2.5 that we'll sew that to. And then the units that we just made with the 2.5-inch squares. And we'll just sew it together like a 9 patch. Here, 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 here. Once your rows are together, then you're just going to sew the rows together for the block. And that's how you make the piece of cake X and plus block. Thanks. See you next time. Bye.